Good evening or afternoon, actually. This is a lot earlier than I usually stream, but that is for a good reason because today we are joined by an Australian. How are you doing tonight, Marcus?
I'm well, thank you, Mr. Patriarch. I can't complain. The weather's nice here, and although we are sort of in lockdown purgatory, shall I say, it's not quite hell yet. I'm sure it can get worse. No, things aren't bad. It could certainly be worse, and I appreciate the invite that you kindly issued me, and I'm quite interested in tonight's discussion because for those who do happen to know and have heard me before, I actually hail from a farming family, so this is a subject rather close to my heart. And actually, if you remember, Ms. Patriarch, it's the subject that brought us together actually on AA stream, in fact.
Yeah. No, that's right. We were both guests, and one of the things you were talking about was kind of the malign influence of, I guess, foreign capital and buying up Australian farmland, and how that sort of posed a sort of geo-economic risks to the country. So
if we want to put it delicately, the aggressive gutting of the Australian agricultural sector,
Yeah. No, and I thought that was real interesting, and then I was like, I should have this guy on to talk about this a little more. So yeah, thank you guys for coming on. I know it's a little bit earlier in the day, but it looks like we got 12 homies here, 12 nerds, 12 boeren. That's Afrikaans for farmers, 12 farmers or boeren wannabes. So tonight we're just going to be talking a little bit about the history of Australian agriculture. And then Marcus is going to be waxing lyrical about kind of the present state of Australian agriculture, kind of the economics of it, how it works. And then we're going to sort of move into kind of the specific cultural aspects and effects that agriculture has on both a community and sort of a nation as a whole. And then kind of touch back kind of what we're talking about earlier with the foreign interest and potential enemies of farming, hence the title of the stream tonight. So if you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask Marcus or myself, you're welcome to send a super chat. Any support is always appreciated. And if not, we'll just sort of skim through at the end of the stream and kind of go over any questions you may have. So I myself did not grow up in a farming family directly. Alaska is not pretty good land for agriculture, as you could probably guess. However, I do have an uncle in the state who grows potato peanuts or peanut potatoes. Tubers are one of the few things that actually grow quite well in those northern climes. And I did work for him for a number, I think 2 or 3 summers. And that was actually my first job, was helping my uncle plant zucchinis and dig up peanut potatoes and stuff like that, and harvesting rhubarb. Rhubarb also grows very well up there, oddly enough, probably because of all the sunlight that occurs in the summertime. But that's about the extent.
Mr. Patriarch, have you heard the joke, the real dad joke about rhubarb?
I have not.
So when someone asks you if you grow rhubarb and someone says to you, "Oh, what do you put on rhubarb?" and you inevitably say manure, the dumb thing is to say, "Oh, well, I prefer custard on mine."
I prefer custard on mine. Yeah. No.
Rhubarb, sorry, guys, that's my dad joke allocation.
It's all good. It's all good, man. As a dad, I appreciate dad jokes more than most. But yeah, rhubarb is actually quite good to make pie. I've always liked rhubarb pies a lot. But
that sort of tells into my second calling in life, which is, as you know, hospitality, chefing. So yes, definitely. If anyone likes baking, definitely do like bake rhubarb and pear, rhubarb and apricot. It's definitely a lovely ingredient for pie making.
It is. It has a nice tartness that pairs very well when mixed with a sweet berry.
Certainly.
But that's basically the extent of my personal connection to agriculture. Although my grandparents were Dutch immigrants in South Dakota, and they farmed for years there. So they're multi-generational farmers. But I guess with my grandma is sort of where the line broke, so to speak. And so I have ancestry in farming, but me, myself, my parents not in the farming game. But that's where Marcus comes in tonight to come in with his expertise and his long. I almost said checkered history, but that would be incorrect. His long sterling history in the farming game.
My father might say checkered, but I don't want to sell myself too short here.
All right. All right, man. So can you let's get it started. Let's talk about, give us the rundown of history of kind of agriculture in Australia, or with your family, or however you want to go with it.
Well, I actually didn't think to look past when because like I said to you, I actually had a couple of conversations with my father about this subject. So I was just sort of trying to fill in details and what have you. And for those who do listen to AM streams and are aware that we can get into some level of detail, well, let's just say that trait is of a factor of 1.0 inherited from my dad. So it definitely runs in the family. Nice. I've got a full rundown in notes of things to say for tonight. Nonetheless, just for the sake of the audience, and you'd know this because you're present in the South Africa over there, and there's quite an extensive heritage of agriculture in the former still the Commonwealth, but in the former British colonies, there's quite a proud tradition of the pioneer settler, and obviously they went to the United States. I mean, they were the backbone of the 13 colonies. The British conquered the Cape Colony, and alongside the Dutch, you have the Transvaal and Natal, the Orange Republic. They settled in that part of the world, and obviously the British came to Australia and to New Zealand as well. And there's and obviously because these places were quite far flung, and especially from England. I mean, Australia and New Zealand are that much further than what, say, South Africa was, or that cross Atlantic journey to the 13 colonies. There was a very strong culture of striving for self-sufficiency quite early, and quite similar to the veldt in South Africa. The Australian bush, it's quite a rough country, and it's quite an unforgiving country. A lot of our sort of early sort of folklore in this country are characters such as Burke and Wills and Ned Kelly, and these sort of pioneers and explorers who venture into the bush and don't come back. And people come across men who had perished in the outback 10 years prior, and they find a map stuffed in their knapsack, because they didn't make it back home. I know we meme today about Australia just being desert and crocodiles and insects that'll kill you, and today it's a bit of a joke. But even in the modern day, you definitely don't want to be caught out in places that it is an unforgiving continent. And so it did breed a number of generations of quite hardy sort of bushmen and pioneers and pioneer farmers over here, and very inventive ones as well. Ingenuity has always been a frequently occurring trait in farmers here, and it's been true of generations of people who adopted farming here. And for I've sort of talked about it in lighter detail in other streams, in other places and other channels, but Australia, up until, you might say, Second World War, was still very predominantly sort of Britannic in culture, very sort of that Anglo-Saxon Celtic background of Scots and English and Irish, etc. That dynamic changed sort of after World War One, but certainly after World War Two, you had a lot of, for instance, a lot of Italians coming here, which is my extraction. Greeks tended to took up more in terms of market gardens and actual farming as such. A lot of Croatians took up farming, in the eastern and western wheat belts, respectively. And a lot of those successive generations of people sort of went out further from the cities and cleared what was sort of what we in Australia refer to as virgin country, and with very modest means, started lives in a really remote part of a very remote continent, and a lot of people did well as a result. And if we get into the economic details, Mr. Patriarch, we'll probably touch on some of the time periods which were a little less fortunate for people. There's a good example here of actually one that is often a conversation around my family's dinner table is actually the early 70s. Because if actually, should I just get into the economics foundations?
Yeah, go for it.
So let's just start this sort of modern period with the 70s, and because of the advances in technology, you're talking combines, which is the ability to seed and fertilize in the same process, towing this sort of contraption behind a tractor, and obviously tractors themselves. I mean, once upon a time, plows were pulled by animals up until 80 years ago, and of course, Australia, due to its remoteness and due to its lack of capital, which existed here for a long time, we were rather slower on the uptake regarding mechanization compared to, say, the United States of America or Britain. You had this development in terms of, like I said, tractors and combines, which allowed farmers to fertilize and to seed at the same time. And this process was occurring obviously around the world. And by the 70s too, there was a lot of the reconstruction had occurred in Europe. Productivity and efficiencies were dramatically improving. And as a result, and for anyone who's sort of remotely literate with economics, all commodity prices or any price of any market is sort of more or less defined by the elasticity of supply and demand. And by the 70s, there was something of a bit of a food glut, particularly in grain production. And this was exacerbated in Australia because our government decided to place a quota on grain production. And it was an entirely regulated system. Both sales within the country and our exports were both regulated as a result of federal legislation. So at the national parliament level, the legislation was passed to have these markets controlled, and to remain that place. Domestically, it was lifted rather soon, but some aspects of this regulation actually stayed in place until literally 10 years ago, which surprises a lot of people. I'm sure that would make AA have a heart attack hearing that, but anyway.
Yeah. No, from what I understand, and it seems to be quite common internationally, but it seems like countries are very keen on putting controls on agriculture, I suppose. So I know here in South Africa during the apartheid years, one of the things that farmers would have to do is they'd have to sell some of their grain to like a board, essentially. So if you wanted to grow and sell bananas, you'd have to sell your bananas to the banana board. And then they would, kind of pay you out and whatever and distribute it and stuff. So there was like a kind of a monopoly buyer situation with at least bananas in South Africa. I know back in the day. And it seems like that seems to be a fairly common thing, this kind of interventionism from the state on behalf of agriculture, I guess.
Yeah, actually, if I can make you laugh, I think it was in WA, they had a potato board up until 2014 that completely regulated the potato market. So, in Australia, they've been quite fond of, issuing licenses for growing things and selling things, very, very eagerly, shall I say. But to go on to this 70s thing, so we had this policy of quotas and quite hefty regulation, and this also coincided. For those who do know, you have the OPEC oil crisis, which triggers in the 70s as well, and because it's overproduction of grain, wheat was approximately $35 a ton, a metric ton, mind you, and it was essentially an unprofitable item to grow at that point in time. And I'll get into price breakdowns afterwards. And if you think that's bad, you're in for a literal shock with what's to come. But in the year 1973, because there were the Soviets had a terrible year. They actually imported wheat in a substantial amount. And actually, there's two quotes. One of them, which I'll say now, one I'll say for later. But one of them was by the Premier Leonid Brezhnev when he famously quipped that. We in the Soviet Union have nothing to eat but shit, but I am pleased to inform you there are plenty of shit, more or less. So that was kind of funny. The Soviet people were told that you had nothing to do but shit, but you had plenty of it. So that goes to show you that the dire straits that was occurring there. And I believe, according to my dad, I think North America had a poor production year as well. So in 1 year, in 1973, in like the growing season, the price of wheat went from $40 Australian to $135, which, if you do the mathematics, is approximately a treble and a bit. Which, if the commodity you're growing or the good that you're making increases 3.5 times in value, you stand to make a good deal of money. It becomes a very profitable thing, providing inflation. Now, what I actually will do is I got a picture here. Are you able to show stuff in your screen or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so
let me see.
Oh, hang on.
I wonder if I can share screen with you. Maybe not. Hold on.
I just got a bunch of stuff still open from my Apostolic Majesty screen. If you can share that link I just sent you, if that's possible.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
I put in the private chat. This is just an indication of inflation. So there was actually a relatively narrow window. So in the quota years from 1970 to sort of 72, so you've got 3 seasons. That's the 70, 71, 72 season. There's an approximately a 5% attrition rate of people leaving their farms, basically walking off, surrendering to the banks. The banks, selling off their property and, giving them enough money to sort of buy a house in the city, kind of thing. And this is the first sort of inkling of that, shall I say, the predatory banking kind of situation that occurs with agriculture and the relationship between farmers and money lenders, shall I say. So in 19, I can't remember what year was it. Well, 71, 72. Because we had a prime minister by the name of Robert Menzies, who was actually the founder of our modern day Liberal Party, and he would turn in his grave if he saw the condition it was in. But nonetheless, the Liberal Party had sort of steered the country largely sort of out of the war years and the Reconstruction years, and had offered a lot of stability. But of course, the 70s being the 70s, this character Gough Whitlam came into power, and he in some ways, kind of like the Pierre Trudeau of Australia. In some ways, for those who might get the reference, and I can't remember to what degree it was. I think he like increased the minimum wage by some absurd amount, like 40 or 50% or whatever. And you can see by that line on the graph there, that's the consumer price index, which is sort of an indication of inflation. And in 2 or 3 years, it jumps from 5% to 15%. So farmers who had kept their farms and took harvests off in 1973, 74, when that price went from $40 to $135, did very well. And of course, my family was one of them, because we're still farming, or we just actually, with we're still in the industry. So you can understand. And then you've got the OPEC crisis, you've got the increase of inputs regarding energy. And actually, as my dad said, and I'll touch on some of these figures later, but in 1970, fuel was $2 a barrel. I'm talking Australian dollars, by the way. And by 1973, it had gone up to $3.50, which obviously doesn't sound much, but if you're talking percentage terms, you're talking, 60, 70% increase in a calendar year. So that's your energy. So that's a pretty dramatic increase on inputs already. And of course, like I said, with that increase in the minimum wage too, your labor costs have gone up quite dramatically in a very short space of time. But nonetheless, the profits from the wheat, from the bad Northern Hemisphere season and those 2 growing seasons were astronomical, irrespective of those changes. And so a lot of this was sort of the first phase of genuine reconstruction or restructuring rather of the agricultural industry, and the beginning of this consolidation of farmers and farmland, which has sort of continued unabated ever since. And this also begins the drive for economies of scale in terms of production of grains by farmers who are in the grain growing industry, because there's some overlap. Some farmers, and it's become increasingly the case where farmers will be just grain only. Some farmers will run livestock only, and some have a bit of a hybrid system of running livestock and wheat, which is what my family do. It's also the beginning of the demographic shift, which, for those who caught the UO that both myself and Mr. Patriarch were on, this is where I talk about I think you might remember I was talking about the population transition from rural areas to city areas, and how we once upon a time had a much more balanced demography, whereas sort of nowadays Australia has a population of somewhat 25, 26 million, of which 97% of that sits on the coastline in sort of 4 or 5 cities, or not 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 cities. Therefore making us the perfect police state, but we'll get to that later. So come the mid 90s, because it's just another sort of time print that we can use. There's a transition in Australia to something we call direct drilling, which is sort of when you seed directly into the soil without actually plowing it. If you sort of have a picture of farming, you tend to think of tractors pulling plows and turning over soil to sort of prepare the soil for the coming crop, and that's a time and test methodology that sort of stems from Europe, because it's sort of like a natural way of killing weeds prior to the prevalence of pesticides of herbicides and top cropping and inter cycle sort of chemical controls, which I have my own beef with, but I don't want to rant on that too long because it's not the subject necessarily of this discussion. But this actually provides so you there in South Africa would have pretty similar geography in parts to, say, Australia. Like I said, the veldt and the bush probably aren't too dissimilar in climatic terms and in geographic terms. And this allows us to actually increase our sort of land utilization and intensity of crop rotations from roughly 50% to somewhere in the order of 70 to 80%, depending where it is. And also what I can actually sort of mention here is I started this sort of conversation with that wheat price in 73 jumping from $40 to $135. Well, labor in 1970 was $1.50. I mentioned that. Fuel was $2 a barrel, and fertilizer was roughly $20 to $25 a ton. In the present day, those figures, so labor's gone from $1.50 an hour to $35 to $40 an hour. Fertilizer went from $25 a ton to $700 to $800 a ton. And even though oil was more expensive 10 years ago because we had that spike before the GFC where it went up to like $140, $50 a barrel, it's presently at $65 a barrel. But nonetheless, if you sort of extrapolate these input costs, like I said, labor, fuel, chemicals, etc., you're looking at approximately a 20 to 25-fold increase in costs alone, right? Depending on what a farmer grows and what their portfolio is regarding sheep or cattle or pigs, or predominantly wheat, predominantly barley, canola, lupins. There's a whole bunch of variables. And also geography, like if you're a farmer in West Australia, you farm differently to how you farm in South Australia, which is different to Queensland, different to New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania. Every state has a different climate in some ways, because we are essentially a country continent. So we sort of have our own weather systems, if that makes sense. And just for some perspective, I spoke about the wheat price. So just at the start of the uptick in the 70s, right? So 72, just prior to the big spike, you have wheat at $40 a ton. Wheat presently in the year 2021 is $350 a ton, which is a 9-fold increase. So can you see how there's a mismatch between a 9-fold increase in profit, but a 20 to 25-fold increase in costs?
Right. Yeah. No, you're behind the 8 ball.
Well, my old man is. I'm sort of channeling him at this point. But this goes to show you the degree to which the fat on the meat on the bone has thinned off considerably in this field. Farming has become very costly. It's become difficult. And say, for instance, if I can sort of extrapolate from whereabouts we farm in Australia and sort of to the approximate size of, say, our farm and our neighbours and where we approximately are, a crop will cost, give or take, 1.4 to 1.6 million to actually put in, all costs accounted for: seed, fertilizer, chemical application, etc. Now, if you have a crop failure, as a family business, you're down that much in the gurgler. You have to make that profit up in your harvest, and if you have livestock, come the end of the year, otherwise it's just red ink all over your balance sheet. It's a big responsibility to take on as a family business.
Yeah, no, it is. And just for the audience's sake, so you said between 1.4 to 1.6 million Australian dollars at current exchange rates. That's about 1,090,000 USD. So that's not chump change. And yeah, if you incur all those costs, and you get no payoff or very little payoff relative to what you're expecting on the back end of that, you can see how very quickly you could be up shit creek in no time.
And just to sort of touch onto that as well, I say this because it makes the equation quantitative, right? Is that and by all means convert this to rand if for your sake over there in South Africa, but in Australia, for instance, right, an approximate like take sourdough organic stuff out the picture. But if you're going to the shop to get a good sort of middle of the range, sandwich sliced bread, you're looking about anywhere from $2.50 to $3.50, like $2.50, $3.50, sort of thereabouts, sort of under $4. But again, it depends on what brand you buy. But with that being the cost of a slice of bread, I'm going to ask you to guess, Mr. Patriarch, how much do you think the farmer sees from that end sale of a loaf of bread, as a guess?
As a percentage?
Oh, as a number. So, like, let's just say the dollar, the price at the end of the supermarket is, let's just say $3.50, right? $3.50.
All right.
Out of that, how much do you think the farmer will pocket at the end? And the chat's welcome to guess as well, should they be interested.
On a $3.50 loaf of bread, what the farmer gets out of that? I would imagine there's probably a lot of value added, so to speak, in the production chain of a loaf of bread. So most of that's probably a lot of that's going to get eaten up by the retailers. A lot of that's going to be eaten up by the transportation. A lot of that's going to be eaten up by the bakery suppliers for the packaging. They'll get a cut of that. So I would guess probably on a loaf of bread at $3.50, maybe 50 cents. I don't know.
Close. Approximately 40 to 45, because essentially if you break it down on a dollar per dollar basis, it's between sort of 5 and 10 cents. Which is ironic, because if you actually think about it sort of logically, I mean, yes, you've got the grain handlers, you've got the importers, the exporters, you've got the grain merchants, you've got grain millers, you've got the bakers, like you say, transportation costs. There's a whole bunch of structural costs in there. But at what point in that production process is the vast vast majority of that production risk held by whom?
The farmer.
Obvious. Exactly. Yeah. So in the instance of the crop failure, you can say, for example, I'm a miller in New South Wales. I can import grain from South Australia. I can buy it from WA. I can buy it from Queensland. And if Australia has a national shortage, well then, I can get grain from Canada. I can get, grain from Argentina. I can get it from Russia. Like there's alternatives, and then the farmer itself is really sort of screwed. And just for the audience sake too, because I'm sure people would be aware that most countries, and predominantly North America and Europe, there's huge amounts of subsidies going into grain growing, into farming, agriculture quite broadly. In Australia, farmers get a tax rebate on diesel usage. That's it. We get a tax rebate. So
whereas a lot of American farmers are paid not to grow or raise certain livestock. I know until fairly recently, I think it was lambs, but there was a guy who was a lamb farmer, and he was basically paid by Uncle Sam not to raise lambs because subsidies. He's like, all right, cool. You want to maintain my lifestyle and pay me, current market rate for lamb not to grow them. Okay. So it's kind of seems like an uneven playing field.
Indeed. And of course, on that basis as well, I mean, because if I remember correctly, you're from Alaska, right? Originally
Yeah.
Okay. So, you would be quite aware that if you go into a supermarket and you read the ingredients list of anything that comes out of a box that was made in a factory, you're bound to find high fructose corn syrup.
Right.
And so this is where my keto pill will rise to the surface and bubble with anger. That essentially to artificially inflate domestic prices for something like corn syrup, right? And let's just face it, anyone here in the chat who's actually sort of remotely interested in nutrition and health, stay the F away from high fructose corn syrup. Like, it literally destroys your pancreas because of the effect it has on insulin resistance. anyway, so just by little dabs of high fructose corn syrup in your bread, your milk, your staples that are made, in ungodly quantities on a daily basis. Of course, it's going to have a push price effect on commodity prices. It's going to create essentially in our fields we talk politically, in terms of like manufactured consent, like manufactured narrative. Well, this is sort of manufactured price making in a way of like, oh, let's just throw through corn syrup and everything, and create this sort of artificial demand for a product that's pretty crap by and large. And so that's sort of the rough sort of standing of the Australian standpoint and the market element of it. I have some other stuff here, but I might leave it maybe for the end of the chat, or if anyone actually has any technical questions, because there's some really interesting stuff that my dad did actually share with me. But we also have the title about the enemies of farming, and like we spoke about in the just when we were just having a quick chat before we started here, there's I would call it is technically the white elephant in the room, but really in this instance it's the big red elephant in the room with a hammer and sickle painted on its side. And that's obviously the USSR question. So before I ramble onto that, do you have anything you wish to interject with, or of course the chat? I mean, you're all here. Do you have a question to ask me before we move on?
Yeah, sure. So you're talking about the USSR, right?
So I'll head there. Yeah.
Okay. So in my education, one of the things that we talked about was I kind of specialized in Soviet history a little bit, and I know that in the pre-Soviet era, what became the Soviet Union was a net exporter of grain, and they were particularly in Ukraine, extremely fertile land. The land was so fertile, evidently, that they would even just take topsoil from Ukraine and then ship it around, Europe as fertilizer. But naturally, as one might expect with any understanding of economics, the collective farming structure of the, I think they were called kolkhoz, basically destroyed agriculture in the Soviet Union. So what was once a country that was a net exporter of grain, which used the exports of grain to sort of fund, industrialization and whatnot, eventually became a largely net importer of grain. They couldn't grow their own food in enough quantities to feed the population. So, yeah, no, that's basically what I understand with Soviet agriculture. And then there was, of course, the Holodomor and whatnot. But all that was basically coming in after collectivization, where Stalin's like, all right, you guys need to make plan, so to speak, and we're just going to take everything because you guys are holding out on us, and then locked down the country and millions of people starved to death. So yeah, but that's kind of my understanding of the agricultural situation transitioning from the Tsarist era to the Soviet era.
Yeah, and actually, this I hazard to go here too much, but just because I think you and Prudentialist and actually AM has that one stream too about you guys have sort of touched on the origins of fascism as well, and there's a really interesting relationship too between that system of ideology of government and agriculture, and I'll get there in a second. But what can be said for the Russian question and the Soviet Union is this, and I'll start on this point. You raised a really good one actually about the Russian Empire, under the Tsars, under the Romanovs, and I've heard my dad say this a million times, and it's true, that prior to the First World War, the largest port in terms of exporting tonnage of wheat in the world was actually Odessa. Wasn't Sydney, wasn't Hamburg, wasn't Boston or Charleston or what, another support.
Somewhere on the Great Lakes. Yeah.
Not the Great Lakes, not Chicago. No, none of it. It was Odessa. Prior to 1914, it was Odessa. And for anyone who's sort of, and I mean, you mentioned it too. So but if anyone who's sort of been in that area or familiar with the entire Black Sea region, the Ukraine, the sort of the beginning of the steppe, just beyond the Carpathian Mountains, there's this beautiful, rich, dark earth that is just perfect for growing crops, and that sort of geography, coming off the Carpathian Mountains, the rivers they run with, strong currents of beautiful water, and as you travel sort of further east and north as well, you sort of enter the Donbass, and again you're getting all that Russian water that's sort of coming down from the sort of the highlands of the country and off the Urals. And there's no shortage of water, because I mean the old adage is in agriculture that you can make money from mud but not from dust, and that rings true in no matter what commodity you're growing or breeding in the case of livestock. And so Russia, despite its antiquated infrastructure and the Tsar's reluctance, the Romanovs' reluctance to sort of heavily industrialize the country, say compared to Prussia and the German Empire, and compared to Austria-Hungary, who by the start of World War One had very sophisticated and very extensive railway systems, and Russia was a very different story. And despite all that, Russia was still able to produce large quantities of wheat and export it to world markets. This sorry, we're going to ask something?
Oh no, I was just going to say, got a question here from Archangelis. Archangelis. I heard it's less productive now. Is that true? So I guess he's talking about the region of Ukraine where this farming is.
Oh, I was going to say, just add us Archangelis if you're referencing Ukraine specifically or Russia, because I will actually get to that, because it's actually quite the remarkable story with Russia. But just at me, and if you just specifically ask us or tell us which country you're referring to. So obviously, with the advent of the the war, it breaks out, and we all know that it all goes quite terribly bad for the Russians, sans the Brusilov offensive. But nonetheless, in 1917, the Russian army sort of collapses in the face of the Germans and the Austrians, and they have the provisional government under Kerensky, and obviously the Tsar abdicates, and they have Kerensky's government, and then the Lenin sort of launches the October Revolution in Ukraine. I'll get there in a sec, Archangelis. Lenin undertakes the October Revolution, and there's a terrible civil war that occurs in Russia for the next sort of 3-4 years. And this is the thing, and this is an interesting sort of starting point, ideologically speaking, that despite the fact that certainly for those times, I mean, some farmers have done quite well in recent years, but unless you're sort of an upper class landed gentry, say like in the sort of British manorial style, most farmers were of quite modest means, and most farmers weren't particularly well to do. What the communists sort of hated about farmers is they were generally socially conservative, arguably reactionary in the Russian context. They would have been absolutely accused of being counter-revolutionary influences, and a large number of Russian peasants actually fought in the White Army, the counter-revolutionary armies under the likes of Kolchak and Denikin, Yevgeny Miller, and others. And so when the Reds eventually prevailed at the end of the Russian Civil War, the kulaks, as we called them, the farmers, were the first communities essentially targeted by the new Soviet regime. And of course, when you kill the entire class of people who are actually competent farmers, who, to whatever rudimentary degree that they understood agronomy and they understood climate and these sort of things, the fact is they knew how to technically farm.
Yeah, the tens of farming were liquidated.
Literally, and the ones who weren't liquidated escaped. I mean, for instance, when my family settled here after the Second World War in the 50s. We actually, where we moved to, there was actually 2 Ukrainian kulak farmers in our district who fled, the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, which is quite interesting. Even Australia, they even came as far as Australia. Interestingly, but the fact is that the regime, the Soviet regime, killed its almost entire class of competent farmers, and then sort of under that Marxist-Leninist doctrine, parceled out land and redistributed it for the good of the motherland, and to stick one up the bourgeoisie. The Soviets more or less were incapable farmers for a long time thereafter, and some would argue never really recovered from it. And this is, of course, worsened in 1945 because two things happened. One, you arguably have a whole other generation of Russian and non-Russian men who were killed in a pretty cataclysmic war. And then, of course, you have the expansion of the USSR's borders, whereas prior to World War II in 1939, they bordered the Baltic countries. Poland has a frontier that lies further east. Romania is at its largest extent. By the end of 1945, and sort of as a consequence of the war, you have not only the Soviets have pushed the technical Russian borders westwards, but they've integrated the Baltic countries. They've integrated Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria into the Warsaw Pact sphere. And most of their young men have also died in the Second World War. And then on top of that, they've had an inefficient sort of centralized Soviet Bolshevik sort of economy installed on top of that, which is inherently inefficient, which is inherently unproductive, which, there's no, for all the guys of our approximate ideological ilk will, have our gripes with materialism, and rightly so. But, if we're talking economics solely, at the very least, a capitalistic framework gives you incentive to be productive and for profit and to be efficient at what you do. This isn't necessarily true in the Soviet system. And so basically up until the fall of the wall in 1990 and the period following Glasnost and Perestroika under Gorbachev, and then the transition to Yeltsin, the Soviets almost never export grain, and most of the time either are barely feeding their own people or abjectly importing, which is the second quote I was going to mention, and that is let me just find my notes. The Russian sort of Politburo used to joke that we planted the wheat in Russia in autumn, and then in the summer it's harvested in Canada. So basically, sort of saying that the grain they were feeding their own people with was basically being grown in the Northern Hemisphere, which is quite funny. But this is the sticking point, right? So after the sort of turbulent and sort of ineffectual Yeltsin years, Putin comes to power in 2000. So from 2000 to 2005, there's an economic stabilization that occurs under sort of Putin's first tenure, and Russia no longer imports grain. And from 2000, I think 5 or 6 becomes the first year they register sizable exports. And from 2005 to 2015, they go from being a net exporter to being the largest exporter in the world. And they've been the largest exporter of wheat since 2015. So another statistic here.
So just a quick, you say to this day, Russia is the largest exporter of grain at current year?
Yeah, in current year. So from 2015 onwards, Russia has been and remains the world's largest single exporter of wheat.
Okay. That was a bit surprising to me. I thought it was the United States, but I guess the U.S. specializes mostly in maize, right?
Well, the United States grow a lot of soybeans, which, as we know, the Afghanis rejected wholesale, and a lot of corn, obviously, because of the subsidy, and also a lot of soybean and corn is used for animal feedlots and that sort of stuff.
Right.
But according to what my dad was saying, I think the United States have roughly grown a consistent amount of wheat from about 1995 to now. It hasn't changed. It's just proportionally they are planting more soybean and corn and therefore harvesting more. Whereas with wheat, the amount that they seed has slightly diminished, but sort of the increase in yield has more or less balanced that out. Gotcha. So in 1990, global production of wheat was 550 million tons thereabouts, right? In the present year, that yield has increased to, depending on the season, of course, and climatic considerations, yields are approximately 750 to 800 million tons. And a lot of that has come out of Russia because Russia itself now produces, for instance, this year, they've actually had a bad year in Russia. They were forecast to grow, I think, 120 million and only ended up picking up less than 80 million. So that was quite a bad forecast to miss nearly 50% of your yield by analysis. But nonetheless, if you look at that increase in world production in 30 years, that's a broad increase in productivity across the globe. But the Russians themselves have made up a massive part of that themselves, and that is because of the massive amount of money that's gone into Russia, a large amount of expertise in the form of agronomists, of engineers, and actually entire businesses have gone in. And now you can't buy land in Russia because they're a little bit smarter than us Australians. They don't sell their land to foreigners, but they permit the leasing of land, and a lot of this, very based and very red-pilled and very patriotic, we are not going to sell any part of the Rodina, and so without losing their sovereignty, they brought in a whole raft of the specialists and expertise to vastly overhaul their methods and to vastly overhaul their their techniques and their scientific understanding of growing grain. And as a consequence, it's become one of their main exports, and it's become a very important part of the Russian economy, never mind just agriculture. And it's quite an amazing turnaround, for those, you might say, who sit more on the neoliberal or neocon side, still think that Russia's, ruled from the Kremlin by a comrade chairman. Russia has managed to pick itself up from a literal collapse of the country, and in 30 years has become the world's single biggest exporter of grain. I mean, that's quite the miracle, no matter how you dice it up or what your attitude of them might be.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just seeing here from ultra radical centrist: reject soy, return to potatoes. It appears.
I regret to inform you they're both lectins. So. But yes, potatoes are infinitely better than soy. At least they're not phytoestrogens. I'll give you that much. And just for the sake of the argument as well, just to fill it in, Australia in 1990 had a wheat production of 20 million, and in the present day has a production of 25 million. The difference is that Australia, across the board as a country, we sort of export about 60% of our produce, of which the Western states, so by that I'm including sort of the South Australia and Western Australia, because they have a smaller sort of domestic population, export as much as 70 to 80% of their product, whereas the eastern states would probably export around 50 to 55%. So basically of the international market of production, we don't really make up a lot of space, which, like my dad says, really puts into question the quota years. Like, the amount that we would have put to market and into global production really was not going to make a sticks difference. But, you put a left-wing party and they think that anything makes sense, given their rationale regarding economics, because, it's always, control and, sort of supply side, and that's just not how it really works,
Yeah. So but basically...
just one last thing, sorry. And of that global production of 750 to 800 million, approximately domestic, like each nation in consideration, because for instance, the two biggest producers in Europe are France and Germany, right? If you take Russia out of the equation, Italy's a relatively big producer. The Italians grow more rice and corn, for instance. Romania is quite a big producer, interesting enough, because they actually buttress onto Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine itself is a massive producer. And the thing to consider too about this Russia via the USSR thing, I think the USSR, I did mention, included all those countries that had really brought behind the Iron Curtain. When the breakup happened in 1990, Russia lost the Ukraine. Russia lost, the control of their sort of hegemonic control of these nations that made up the Warsaw Pact. So what's made out of Russia today is actually from solely territorial Russia. It's the Caucasus regions, it's the Donbass, it's the bordering regions that they have with Ukraine, and sort of parts of like that sort of southern expanse that lies west of the Ural Mountains. I mean, that's just the Russians within their own territory doing this. So it's even a more wondrous achievement if you take that into consideration. And of that sort of 750 to 800 billion ton production, about 120 to 150 million is actually traded amongst nations. The rest is all sort of domestic consumption within each country. So for the Australians, because we are proportionally a export market, in that context, we have international economic factors influence us, but based on worldwide output, we are less important.
Gotcha. So proportionally to what you guys grow, you export a lot, but still, it's kind of a I don't want to say a drop in the bucket, but relative to somebody like Russia who's making tons and tons and tons of grain, it bears relatively less on affecting international prices, essentially.
That's right. And also, because I don't want to ignore him because he was good enough to a super chat and b at us, but Archangelis, Ukraine obviously for technological purposes produces more than what it used to, but let's just say that it's not the sole reason. There's a whole bunch of reasons. Some from an ethnogenesis perspective, some are from a territorial perspective, some of them from a water availability perspective, some are from a strategic perspective, some are from a resource perspective in the case of industry and coal and raw materials. But this actually is a factor in the Donbass Novorussia question between Ukraine and Russia as well. Just to answer your question.
Okay, and I'm sure that the conflict that's been going on there has had rather negative had a rather negative impact on agricultural production within Ukraine itself, I could imagine.
Certainly in the regions that are in contention, which sort of sit in that eastern, what is eastern Ukraine or western Russia, depending how you flip it, but within that Donbass region, exactly, yeah.
Definitely. Now, sort of moving on here to, I guess, kind of the cultural effects of agriculture on a state, province, country, community, so on and so forth. One of the interesting things I've noticed.
I'm sorry for that 50-minute intro, by the way.
No, man. No, that was great. I was like, oh, great. I was worried we wouldn't have I was worried I wouldn't have enough material. No, we got plenty, man. This is great.
You can all thank based Mr. Furious the Senior.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, sir. But I guess kind of transitioning now to kind of how agriculture sort of affects social structures and settlements. One of the things that, coming from where I do, there wasn't really much of an agricultural economy in the state that I come from, right? So, like I said, there's one town that does have kind of that vibe a little bit. They'll grow hay and whatnot, and like I said, there's some potato fields, and that's about it. But not a whole lot in terms of large scale production. About the only things that they grow are, potatoes and carrots for like feeding the state essentially. And I don't even think that they make enough to sort of feed the, local population of Alaska. Most of the economy of the state is, of course, concerned with petroleum, also mining, also fishing. And there could be, I guess if you consider livestock agriculture, there could be a potential market for raising reindeer in the state. But the Food and Drug Administration won't classify reindeer as a livestock. So essentially they're largely disadvantaged relative to cows, for example.
Do you know what the motivation for that would be, just out of curiosity?
Probably protecting the beef farmers, I would imagine.
Oh, well, that, and also there's always pressure from environmentalists, for protection of the species, no matter how idiotic it might be, because we're touching on culture. I mean, this is a slight divergence, but it's kind of relevant, so I want to sort of touch on this. And this is the power of what we might call the cathedral, or the whatever phrase you wish to use, but the image that we have of animals and the way they're sort of portrayed in movies and cartoons, and farmers will sometimes joke. And listen, by and large, most farmers are not cruel, and in fact, most farmers actually genuinely care about their animals. So allow me to place that caveat in there before I proceed. But nonetheless, most people have this kind of, oh, Bambi's, poor mum got shot, and it's like this. It's the origin point, the
right.
Genesis point of the humanization of animals. And there's a really, really good guy on YouTube. He actually, we're mutuals on Twitter nowadays, because I actually have loved his work, because he's really good. He's really on point with nutrition. Actually, there's a guy called Tristan Haggart, and like he's like,
oh yeah,
try, you know who he is?
Primal
yeah, Primal Edge Health. Yeah.
He's on. I came across him because he'll do collab streams with Jay Dyer very often, and that's kind of
Yeah.
where I ran into him. But yeah, cool
Yeah,
guy.
so it's like super keto pilled, super like Christ pilled. He's definitely sort of our guy in many ways. You know, it'd be great if like one of us actually sort of got in touch with him one day, because he's really smart, and he's done it the hard way. You know, like he tried vegan. You know, he tried all these things, and he sort of he got to where he got to through a lot of trial and error. Anyway, my point being is that you know, he touches on this a lot because people in his sphere and who he talks to, in a lot of his monologues, he even sort of touches on it, that, you know, a lot of these, we know what began with, say, you know, Malthusianism, what sort of began with that sort of Seventh-day Adventist kind of Puritanism, which is sort of behind the Kellogg and Sanitarium companies, and, you know, oh, here, eat this breakfast kibble because, you know, it you know, reduces your propensity for erections, and it, you know, lowers the birth rate and this sort of stuff. Like, you know, it sounds ridiculous, but if you read what these people wrote, that's exactly what their motivations were. And and a part of it is and we see it, you know, with veganism, we see it with the you know, the Greta kind of movement, and this, you know, this sort of creeping veganism, and how, you know, you get these young people and it's like, oh, you know, but they're sentient and, you know, animals and stuff. And again, I will emphasize that this is not a call for cruelty. It doesn't mean that animals you know, should be ill-treated. Like, ultimately, I think truly one of the best examples of a person's character is actually how you treat creatures that, you know, are below you in the food chain. You know, like, if someone kicks a dog, you know, or a cat, you know, because they're shitheads, like, stay away from those people, because they're telling you something about them without saying a word, right? But in the context of humans belonging in the food chain, and there being sort of a food pyramid, and the fact that we have evolved a specific way, right? Us and animals have a dynamic. Let's just put it that way. You know, like, us and chickens have a reciprocal relationship. Us and cattle have a reciprocal relationship. Us and sheep, and, you know, all these species have reciprocal relationships, right? Like, if vegans got their way, like 95% of livestock would have to die because there'd be no one to look after them, right? And a part of this, the reason I sort of reference Bambi, is because it's this humanization of animals, right? And it's this sort of falsification of a morality around this subject, right? And say, for example, I'm sorry, I did send us on a tangent here, but like what you're saying about, like, the deer and elk and that sort of stuff, and I think even Rogan talks about it, like, even with his moose hunting or whatever he does in North America, there, in the northern United States, is that people have sort of overly humanized what are wild creatures and what are food sources, and if you have too many of a species, right, your ecology will be thrown out of whack. Like, there's a reason why humans hunt, is because we have an active role in the symbiosis of an ecology, of an environment, you know.
No, that's definitely true. I know here in South Africa there was they're having a problems with the elephants traipsing all over the Kruger Park and just crushing all the vegetation and stuff, and basically deforesting areas, which has, you know, negative impacts on the creatures that live in the forest. And normally, you know, there would be some degree of hunting going on, some degree of, you know, death by attrition or whatever. But because the elephants are protected and the natural predators for the elephants, they don't really run across each other much anymore. There's been calls for, you know, the people who manage the park to sort of allow for elephant hunting for this purpose, like what you're talking about with the environmental equilibrium. But basically, you know, everyone who's like you said, they think about they like animals more than people. They you know,
Yeah,
they won't even hear about it.
it's a moral inversion of natural order, essentially,
Yeah,
and they're proud
exactly.
of it, you know.
Yeah, no, they really are, and it's disgusting behavior, but that's what it is. And, you know, that's not to say, like what you say, be kind to animals, don't be needlessly cruel, but also, you know, just recognize what an animal is, right? It's not a person, it's an animal. And yeah, it may have feelings or whatever, but, you know, God also said kill and eat, right? So
Yeah, that's right.
you know, it's as simple as
And
that.
And if you want to get, I mean, I know this isn't a vegan bashing video, but for the sake of the discussion, just because we're here,
Yeah.
this is why we produce certain gut enzymes. It's why we have the architecture of our oral cavity that we do with our teeth the way they are. It's why we have our digestive system the way we are. I mean, like for instance, one of the best arguments, and I don't know if anyone's actually interested in this, but just because again we're here, if anyone wants a really really sound argument against sort of people who might force you into a corner about the vegetarian or vegan question, is that you say to people that you do not possess the digestive enzymes to break down cellulose, which is the core component of most veg food, particularly like grasses and stuff. You have an inability to break down most cellulose. Humans struggle with I'm just trying to think of the compound now. It's very common in oxalates. That's in things like broccoli stalks and spinach leaves, what have you, right? We struggle with that. Also, most herbivore creatures, take cows, take sheep, for instance, they will chew the cud. They chew on grass and then they swallow it. And these animals do not have one stomach. They don't, in fact, have two stomachs. They have multiple stomachs. And also, alongside having the enzymes to break these things down, they have the architecture to do it. There's a reason why humans have one stomach pouch and a small and a large intestine. And if you look at our evolution, our sort of evolutionary development and our evolutionary biology, again, don't want to get in the weeds about evolution necessarily, but our digestive systems and our brains are our two most blood-intensive organs in our body. And as humans consumed more meat, our brain size increased massively, and correspondingly, our gut size decreased. This is why, for instance, in our closest relatives, which are primates, they have much more guts and much less brains. Why? Because most of them don't eat meat.
Definitely. I'm just seeing here from ultra radical centrist. Bambi's mom deserved it. She and the other deer were overgrazing. That's funny.
Yeah,
but all right.
Sorry, I've set you on a tangent, so let's get back to focus.
That's good. Okay. I see. I got super chat here from FuriusPertinax for 35 South African rands. Thank you very much. I'll buy a boerewors roll and chips with that. Maybe. Divisive question, maybe. But what do you think about the peasant class with regard to current day bright light syndrome? I'm not sure what he means by that.
I have a feeling, because I raised Primal Edge Health, he might be talking about like circadian rhythms and us being very computerized and using lots of technology, and then us having no bad like shitty sleep patterns. If we're incorrect, correct us, by the way. But I just have a feeling that might be what he's getting at. And yes, in fact, like for instance, with my late night streams that I do with Apostolic Majesty, I've actually taken to having like a 3 or 4 hour or even a 5 hour sleep beforehand, because your sleep pattern is the most important thing you have. And in concert with everything else which drives us nuts in modernity, whether it's the entertainment industrial complex, whether it's politics, whether it's the destruction of our communities, which we obviously have to get to, because that's a big part of our conversation today. Whether it's the dilapidation of your nation, or the social ostracism you might have for having the values that you do in current year, you have control of yourself. You have control of your habits. And I mean, I'm no saint. I make mistakes too, and I don't do things as I like to do all the time. But I have a good diet and I fast regularly, and I try and keep my proverbial squared away, and I keep my things orderly, and I do the best I can with what I have at my disposal. And how can I say, facilitating good habits and having environments are within your control by and large. And like for instance, don't watch YouTube and TV like past midnight. Like turn the lights down, go to sleep, keep your body clock intact. Like that's one thing you can do. And if that's sort of what you're alluding to, FuriusPertinax, that's my answer.
Yes, and again, if we were off the mark, you could just send another comment in the chat, and I'll try to find it if we need us to clarify.
And just on the class things, you did mention the peasant class specifically, because we're the ones who get thrown the most trinkets, and also we're the ones who are expected to, how can I say, be less inclined to think for ourselves. And that's a weapon that the establishment and the cathedral have very much used to their advantage. And the most Oh, okay. We completely missed the point.
There we go. Okay, yeah.
Wow. Oh, well,
Okay,
I'd never heard
so
the phrase, so I had no idea. Okay. Wow.
to clear that
I
up,
feel like an
yeah.
idiot now. I feel
No,
like
it's
a
all right.
dramatic idiot.
All right. So, anyways, bright light syndrome is when migrants are given the false impression that another city or area is better, and they believe that they will have a better life there. Yeah. So, I think this is kind of a big problem. um, I think normal people are sold the idea that, yeah, and my wife and I were just talking about this earlier today, but they're sold the idea that um, what you need to do is you need to go to college, you need to get a degree, and you need to get that job, specific job. It needs to be high tech. It needs to be,
Go live
whatever.
in
It
the
needs to
city, discover yourself,
exactly. You need to have this certain cachet, this prestige with your profession, and you're defined by your job essentially. And you go to the city and you live in a box and whatnot. And my wife, brought this up today because of some of the pushback she's been getting from some people in her circles because here before too long she's going to be resigning from her job and being a full time mom, and yeah, and this is all sort of tied in with that mindset, that you have to go somewhere else, be something else, and just doing your thing in your own area where you grew up. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think most
you
people,
might call it it's the individual genesis of this broader societal credentialism. Like it's creating the mold that these people fall into that make them insufferable credentialists themselves.
yeah, no, it's true. And the other thing too is, if you ask most people, probably their happiest time in their life was, in their childhood growing up. And part of that is because of the area, right? The lifestyle, the the people that they knew and whatnot. And yeah, you may be able to make more money going to the city, but all that social structure, that social capital that you have in your area where you grew up in, it doesn't really get replaced when you move away. So um, yeah, my advice on that would be to kind of avoid falling for the trap, unless what you want to do specifically kind of requires you to move to another area. But seeking out novelty for novelty's sake, and that you're going to be someone moving to the city and whatnot, it's just nonsense.
Funnily enough, one of the oldest proverbs that exist in you might say the Western Christian consciousness is the story of the proverbial the story of the prodigal son, and that's a lesson actually ironically in sort of bright light syndrome, strangely enough, of of um, aspiring for a material life over a wholesome, substantive, and authentic life, and just wanting to go to the city with dollary dues in your pocket and to impress people who don't know you and probably don't like you, and to just drink and swill and eat and indulge in an urban environment, basically playing pretend and doing nothing more than engaging in the unending and impossible to quench journey of satiating desire and dopamine sort of impulse, more or less, only to get to the end of that journey and be bankrupt, and not just be bankrupt in a material sense, but then to sort of feel spiritually void at the end of that. And that's an important lesson for all of us. And probably, to answer that super chat, that question is in fact the most profound sort of mythos that exists to prove that point right. And that's a story you could say almost as old as civilization itself. I mean, it's quite literally a biblical story. And funnily enough, I think that's probably a nice way to get this stream more directed at the heart of what we were sort of originally getting at. If you would agree, Mr. Patriarch, because actually that angles us perfectly into the enemies of farming, because it's actually those kind of people who you might say the pretend friends of the prodigal son are the people who probably hate agriculturalists.
Yeah, no, definitely. The structure of farming communities when I came to South Africa was very different from anything that I'd kind of encountered with sort of large urban areas in the United States before, where you have this almost archaic social structure in a sense, where you have the small town center with the businesses, restaurants, maybe a hotel or whatever, and some local businesses, and then on the outskirts surrounding the whole town is just farmland. And there's people who've they own the farms and they've been in the family for generations, and the farm workers who live there and work on these farms, they also have it's almost like old school notions of service a little bit, like my daddy worked for this farmer, and I'm going to work for this farmer too, sort of thing. And their housing and whatnot's taken care for them and whatnot. And there's a there's
They're
a
not.
there's a clear
You might say
hierarchy with the
you
farming
might
life.
say you might say they're not disposable with their relationships. They have a deeper connection, which is more than superficial, which often
Yeah,
happens to be the case with their urbanite cousins.
exactly. Yeah, no, that's the thing. It's not easily gotten rid of. And the farm worker relies on the farmer for sort of employment, and the house is often usually owned by the farm and whatnot. But in turn, the farmer needs the workers as well. And there's sort of this symbiotic relationship, and the towns largely exist to help support the farm and the farm workers. And it's like the left goes on about sustainability and whatnot, and sustainable communities and such. But that really is kind of a type of, not the only one, but a type of sort of sustainable, if I could use that cringe-inducing word, sustainable community, where you have all
You
these
mean
cogs.
you mean sustainable? You know, it's
Yeah,
trendy.
yeah.
You know,
Yes, precisely. But no, it really is. So there's a symbiotic relationship among all the people in the town, with the sort of farm as sort of the hub, which ties everything together, and it's sort of
yeah.
everyone together, I guess. But
Of course, it becomes it's essentially the foundation stone of a community in some ways. Which, if a person casts their mind back right to the origins actually of civilization, you look at the because this is actually a good way to extrapolate this historically. Because I mean, I mentioned the prodigal son, for instance, which this story probably would have occurred in the Fertile Crescent. The basically one of the first motivations for human settlement there, for becoming a sedentary a sedentary species essentially, and producing the first sedentary cultures in Ur and Sumer and Akkad, the predecessors to the Babylonians, of course, in Egypt, the old Levantine cultures that populated the Fertile Crescent. In a historical sense, they had two main motivations. One was they domesticated crops and started planting crops, and essentially, as the Mongols had proved many years later, you can't essentially carry that with you. If you're planting seeds and harvesting, you sort of have to stay in the same spot by necessity. And the second thing is that when you huddle people together, those people need protection. So that's why that most, if you take a city like Jericho or Damascus, or which have been inhabited basically continuously for the best part of 7, 8, 9,000 years. One of the first things that they do is erect defenses. They erect walls. So these people realize that if we band together, we can actually grow crops, and we can produce a consistent food supply that is not dependent on being mobile, semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers. But also that when you bring these people together, then we necessitate the concept of protection and defense, and that these two things sort of come hand in hand. And that's a very much an important, and I dare say undeniable foundation stone of human civilization, just full stop.
yeah, no, what separates civilization from savages in large part is agriculture, essentially. Um, yeah, I mean, there's no way getting around it, because if you are sort of nomadic and not settled, you essentially lack the capacity to sort of be rooted in place, have surplus, and with that surplus, be able to be afforded the opportunity to conduct other things like science, like art, so on and so forth. And going back to sort of the bright lights theme from Philly Hypocrite a little bit. The cities, of course, are kind of centers of culture and business and whatnot. But I think when you get the peasant class, so to speak, to sort of be more nomadic, sort of moving to the cities and here and there, sort of fruitless cosmopolitans and whatnot, it sort of does de-civilize them to a certain extent. That sort of unrootedness, I think, is, I mean, like I said, I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody. So like if you have to, if you're in that situation and whatnot, and you have to go to the city for your job, or you want to live in the city for a little bit for experience sake, that's fine or whatever. But
We
I
are
do think
merely
it does.
surmising and engaging in a thought exercise, nothing more.
Yes. No low IQ criticisms, please. But yeah, I don't think that sort of disconnection from place, from social structure, from a certain amount of permanence is particularly a good thing for people.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. What sorry, pardon me for a second. What I was going to say was what I was going to say is that because I made the point about the the foundation of Jericho and Damascus, the origin essentially of human civilization, is this is why there's an old saying about rural towns, and that is that there are very few bad farmers and there's even fewer dishonest farmers, and that is because take modern context. I mean, I for those who've been listening for the majority of this stream, I rattled off half an hour ago or so some price differentials from say when my sort of family was sort of nascently farming in Australia to today or the 90s, when things were rather different economically, and how cheap most inputs were compared to now, and the value of the dollar was more intact, and you had far more purchasing power with your dollar, and just methodologies were simpler as well. The reason I say that about there's no poor farmers and even fewer dishonest ones is because if you're from a relatively small town, right? I'm talking a place of under 10,000 people, and very specifically in this instance, like under 5 or 2,000. And a lot of towns in Australia don't even get to 1,000 people. They're quite small, and the thing is, you're only going to be able to buy your chemical from one or two places. If you want to hire workers, you've got a very limited labor pool, unless you sort of hire backpackers or people from far away, which is sort of not ideal. It's the next best option in some ways. For instance, if you're a farmer and let's just say you've got an excess of lupins, and the farmer down the road has some sheep and they need lupins for feed, there has to be this reciprocal ability to engage in reciprocal transactions, and in the end, you can't do that in a low trust environment. It doesn't work. And this is why, for instance, like a lot of these towns thrive. When I say thrive, a lot of them have struggled, and we'll get onto the societal stuff hopefully shortly. But these towns, I guess, some of the secret sauce as to why these towns work is the fact that they're at population levels where the high trust mindset and high trust activity remains intact. Like, it's not compromised by the anonymity of mass populace, of being a metropolis, or where people are so many people are squished into such a small space that they don't know each other. They have an incapability of building trust. And then for those of us who are aware of this notion, diversity plus proximity will almost always equal conflict. Most rural areas, certainly in Australia, but I'm sure this is true elsewhere, have rather more homogeneity, and are the inverse of diverse, and therefore have less of these trust issues. So there's a whole host of these factors coming together, but essentially it revolves around the ability to engage in high trust activities, and the ability to maintain social cohesion, and that has been the secret sauce of farming communities for hundreds of years.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, these places don't have a reputation for being, the most conservative parts of their respective countries for a reason. They're it's because of that. What you just talked about, Marcus. Now, I guess kind of going on to our last question here, and I think you've got quite a bit to say on this. What are the interests in sort of undermining agriculture, both sort of foreign and domestic, I suppose? And we can talk about Australia specifically, and then maybe speculate about William Fentz and sort of his shenanigans in the United States.
Yes. Actually, you know what? I think actually in some strange ways, in some strange way, I actually think Italy might be a better starting point if that's permissible.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I mentioned that at the start of the stream that yourself and I think Mr. Prude and Mr. Apostolic had done videos pertaining to fascism, and the interesting thing is that in the countries which adopted that form of government in the as AA would say, the mid-century, and that applies to places such as Hungary, that obviously applied to Italy in this context, is that agriculturalists saw what happened to some degree. You had the Paris Commune, although that was less extensive, but in some ways the French Revolution was in some ways quite anti-agrarian as well, because most of the countryside was quite pro-Bourbon, pro-monarchy, and the intellectuals of the city, such as the Robespierre types, did not like that counter-revolutionary sentiment that existed. And of course, much of the levée en masse gutted the rural areas of the finest young Frenchmen, because they were certainly rather more Chad than their urban cousins. Farmers usually make good soldiers, by and large. And I mean, you guys in the States know that, so many of the as much as I hate to quote him, like Jordan B. Peterson, when he calls it, the corn-fed Iowa boy goes to Iraq, and he's going to be usually a better soldier than the kid who sort of grew up in Brooklyn.
No, that's certainly true.
But that's neither here nor there. The reason I started with Italy is because you had these people who saw the Russian Revolution take place, and it was inescapable. It was even the Soviets themselves were unable to hide the gravity of their excesses and of their cruelty and their sort of murderous, sort of class-driven rampage. And of course, like we stated before, alongside elements, the counter-revolutionary elements of the military, the Cossacks as well. The Kulaks are pretty high on that hit list for the Marxist-Leninists. And so, strangely enough, this is where sort of agriculturalists sort of were left with this binary choice between, well, there are socialists happening, and I mean, obviously there was the Spartacist revolt in Germany, 1919, by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and Paul Eisner, etc. And so the Germans kind of had their own taste of it then, and there was actually the Bavarian Socialist Republic that I think lasted all of a year. So the Germans had their own sort of taste of this as well, although they didn't get to the point of liquidating a class like the Soviets did. But populations in Germany, populations in Hungary, populations in Italy were confronted with this reality that if the Soviets prevailed, if you were a landowner, you were going to be quite literally liquidated. You either were liquidated or you went to the New World. Like, that was it. That was a fundamental choice. And most people nowadays, certainly, people who sit in a more sort of cushy kind of middle of the road position don't like to perform that exercise in their mind. But there were millions of families and men and farmers in Europe who literally had to make this choice. And this is why, for instance, you sort of see a large amount of agricultural support for, say, Mussolini's March on Rome in the 1920s. And I think if you sort of, I'm not saying every farmer's a fascist, that's not what I mean, but some people literally had to make a binary choice because they had no other decision. In the case of Italy, the Italian government was faltering, and that's why Mussolini marched on Rome, and that's why he formed a government with the king's consent. I think leftist thinkers, to their credit, have long memories, and they haven't forgotten that. And they know that a farmer who has land and has property and, in many cases, particularly in the American instance, are, armed and aren't useless and aren't, limp-wristed, urban bugmen kind of thing. They're, although placid and usually sort of go about their business, they are in some ways an existential threat to the aims of the cathedral. Um, they are they're difficult to integrate into, you might call it like a globalist system and a borderless system. They represent a class that just, how can I, farmers, people who own land and own machinery and own animals are just not going to fit that impossible jigsaw piece in the you will own nothing and be happy
Yeah.
formula. You know what I mean? And so I think
Mm.
by virtue of that, farmers across the world have, or certainly in the Western Hemisphere, I know for some, in many ways, Americans and Canadians probably have a better run of it than Australians, but I have this increasing feeling that sort of Australia has become the testing ground for some of this methodology. And I'd often say to my own peers and my family, for instance, like, oh, how does this happen to us? Like, why are we being left behind? Why don't we get good crop insurance? And why don't we get support when times are tough? And why is it our country and our government who consents to this selling of prime farmland to foreign interests and blah blah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The stuff that we spoke about on the UO, where we had been gutted sort of economically, and the agricultural sector was a massive portion of that here. And I think when you look at the William Fent stuff, you look at the clown swab stuff, and this real this deeply disturbing train of thought that people who support this regime change, people who sort of support this ideological framework, have become increasingly vocal and increasingly honest about. And they've made quite patently clear what their end goal is. And I think the independent family farmer who has the traits that I have mentioned previously is a tremendous impediment to that, and presents to them a major point of resistance in an economic context, in a social context, in a raft of different ways. And I think when you consider the fact that how can I say, a physically unimpressive software engineer who sticks his nose into too many, areas that aren't his business becomes one of the largest owners of prime farmland in the United States, that's something you don't ignore.
Yeah. No, I think it's kind of what you're talking about. So long as these rural areas sort of exist and persist, there'll always be an indigestible chunk of people who can't get gobbled up by globo homo, essentially. They may have other sort of social problems, like I know opioids are sort of hitting some of these rural areas a bit harder than other places. But in terms of their mindset and their view on the world and kind of the agendas sort of set for everybody, they're not going to go along with it willingly, essentially. And I think now, just as in the past with the Bolsheviks or whatever, the people, I guess the elites, they know this, right? They know this. So I think kind of in the past, they'd sort of try to handle this sort of crudely, right? So they just sort of liquidate the kulaks, kill them or sort of drive them off their land or demote them and have the town drunk sort of lord it over them or whatever. And then in Italy, particularly during the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, where you had like mass sort of communist socialist uprisings all across the country. As far as I understood, the small business owners and the shopkeepers and the man who sort of owned his own labor or owned his own business and his own enterprise, the sole proprietor, and the farmer were kind of the guys who were into I guess El Duce. And I think sort of going on in the future, the way that they're trying to handle this problem as they see it is by essentially buying them off. So you get the land, you dispossess, you control the food sources, you're able to dispossess or disinherit future generations of potential reactionaries from their environment, And then, now you have a population who is all sort of corralled in the cities. Their food is provided by, mega corporations and whatnot, Monsanto. And so now, you have all the levers you need to sort of, I guess, whip the population into whatever shape you want it to be in.
That's right. And if you remember, I sort of spoke to some degree about this when we're on UO, and I because I mentioned that phrase. I actually can't remember the stat now, but something in the order of I think it's what 3 or 4 farmers in Australia sort of commit suicide every week or every fortnight. Like, it's actually quite a profound problem here, and because of this isolation, like I mentioned, that population disparity of 97% of the population lives on the coast, of which it's mostly 6 or 7 cities. Farmers having, and sort of tangenting onto the point they were saying about how farms have consolidated and got bigger over time to achieve economies of scale. So, like, families are smaller. This is a general par for course of, birth rates and what have you, right? Farmers and farming families are smaller. You have less neighbors. Your towns are smaller because there's less people in them. And when there's less people, you have less essentially inherent local market demand for goods and services. And so, it's hard to get an electrician. It's hard to get a carpenter. It's hard to get a mechanic. And then when you don't have those things, it's hard to keep the doctor there because the hospital can't operate, 5 days a week, and then you can't get nurses. And then those people aren't buying food and vegetables from the shop. And so the shop has less hours, and then they hire less people. And you get this vicious cycle at a very local level. And, in the instance, let's say, for example, AA was to listen to this video, that's a very good sticking point actually for his, well, not sticking point, but it's a point of reflection for his, Trumpton proposal. Because you're talking really, really small scale community there. And this is what has been essentially the death knell of a large number of Australian country towns, has been that vicious cycle. And of course, another part of that is education. And for those of us who are sort of, born, let's say Gen X's, Gen Y's, a lot of us were thrust through primary school and high school, elementary and high school, whatever, to, get ahead, get an education, go to university, the credentialism route, that if you didn't have a bunch of letters next to your name, you essentially didn't have worth as a person, both economically or culturally. And those of us in the know now realize that most of that is complete bollocks. I mean, by all means, if you wish to be an engineer in life, go study engineering because it's worthwhile. If you have talent to be a doctor or a surgeon, go study medicine at university. Like, that's obvious. But there are so many junk degrees and so many people who, like, HR doesn't need a degree, social work doesn't need a degree. Like, there's so much fabrication of sort of like non-important, just non-valid degrees that are sort of invented out of thin air just to create this sort of educational bureaucracy to indebt people, to indebt young people into student debt, and to just make them sort of indentured servitude of the system as a result of this. It's all a part of the machine. Like, and farmers send their kids off to often boarding schools and end up paying even more handsomely for this education. And then most of these kids come out of high school or university just paused, and then they're alienated from their parents who have completely different social values because their kids have been churned through the system. And then you have alienation, and then I spoke about, for instance, the climate in the UO stream and how Australia has had quite a bad sort of decade and a half, 2 decades of quite, shall I say, unseasonable weather and, issues with drought and whatever. And then, of course, because farmers in Australia, we have difficulty with crop insurance and being supported by the government and not being subsidized. There are farmers who just get to the end of their tether, and one night at dinner, they'll say to their wife, "Oh, that was lovely," and then they'll walk to their shed and just shoot themselves. It's horrific, and the rate at which it happens is catastrophic. That's the social dimension of this discussion, and I hope that sort of frames us into where we're going in regards to the subject broadly.
Yeah, and I'm just reading this from Dagbreker. A particular Sky News Australia interview with a farmer from Burke was heart-wrenching. The part where he asked his kids to come home and they replied that there's nothing for them. Yeesh, God.
No, there's less debt. and there's a fulfilling existence where they're their own master. I mean, I don't know what the hell you need more than that,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
And that's the thing too. I mean, I have to admit, I mean, I'm sort of in my 30s now, so my orientation's changed. But I used to struggle with the isolation when I used to go and work when I was younger. And I guess, even though you might be sort of based inherently, you kind of get contaminated. You get sort of touched by the pos either which way. And now that I'm sort of an older person with a different disposition, like I frankly don't care. Like I want to be like Kinky and I just want to, plow my fields and be left the hell alone. Like I don't need people anymore. Whereas like, say when I was 20, I used to like going out at, nightclubs and, getting drunk and going to, live music and stuff like that. But like, I don't need that anymore. Like I've done it and I know it's crap and I can live without it. In fact, there's far more fulfilling things I do. This, for instance, talking
Yeah.
with intelligent, erudite people about things that matter. But like I say, like even someone who's sort of kind of based anyway, and I sort of in my own way have been, you can still get sort of tainted by it, and that's how they sort of win. Because if you're not a person of strong will and of robust character, and with a strong sense of self and self-confidence in yourself and your life decisions, you can easily be sort of guilted and sort of drawn back into the clutches of the system that's designed to debase you and to gut you and to turn you into a compliant, debt-riddled zombie that just sits in the hamster wheel and and exerts for the sole gain of the postocracy.
Yeah. I'm just seeing here from Kit Spicken, they need their fancy pants and lollipops. Yeah, that's essentially it.
Yeah, yeah. It's in a strange way. It's this entire sort of narrative that we sort of been harping on, Mr. Patriarch, is if you could imagine. I referenced the story of the prodigal son earlier, right? It's essentially if you could get the narrative of the prodigal son and that scene from Pinocchio where they go to Pleasure Island and they turn into asses when they're playing pool and playing smoking cigars and drinking booze, which for those of us who watched that for the first time as kids, gave us nightmares. I mean, I remember being terrified when I saw those kids turning into donkeys, right? You know, no, I'm Alexander. I want to go home to my mommy. Yeah, it's essentially what's being done to young people in the West, and very much true for Australia, is the prodigal son and Pinocchio's Pleasure Island. Mash those two together and you have the ultimate youth dystopia. And it's terrifying when you realize the gravity of it.
Yeah. No, I guess just wrapping up here with some questions. I saw another one here. This would be, where was it? Okay, scrolling up. Oh, here we go. From Ospexel. You think anything will happen to subsidy-dependent agriculture?
I guess in some ways, here I've been sort of drawing on literary examples of stuff. I use this quite broadly just to talk about sort of the pos in a broad sense. But one of my favorite narratives to draw inspiration from and to sort of explain my critiques of the system is if anyone who's familiar with Dickens, in terms of either having read his novels or watched the movie adaptations of his books, is his little curiosity shop. Are you familiar with it, Mr. Patriarch?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so I'll try and break this down as brief as I can. Little Curiosity Shop is, and in the movie adaptation, the main character is played by Peter Ustinov, who's was a very distinguished British actor of his day. Did a lot of the sort of BBC Dickens sort of things and Jane Austen and whatever. And essentially the two main characters are sort of a dottery grandfather who owns this little curiosity shop, and I think it's his granddaughter or his niece, I can't exactly remember. But he's a wonderful, sort of caring, generous old man, but he has a vice and it's gambling. And eventually he falls into debt and he has to go to a loan shark to keep his shop and what have you. And there's this story, and it's kind of implied that the loan shark kind of covers this young girl, and eventually when she comes of age, like, he'll use the debt as leverage to wed her, even though he's like this disgusting kind of, if you're familiar with Batman, like a penguin like kind of creature. I mean, he's not that deformed, but he kind of has that physiognomy. He's just a
Yeah.
repugnant sort of hunchbacked kind of,
like a sack
greasy,
of potatoes in a soup.
exactly.
Yeah.
He's this greasy sort of repugnant creature. And the long and the short of it is that the doddery old man's brother has made a killing in America as an industrialist, and he hears of his brother's kind of, difficulties. So he journeys back to Britain, to London, and he's got this wonderful sort of mid-Atlantic accent. He's a wonderfully sort of snappy dresser, and he goes to basically service his brother's debt to sort of alleviate his conundrum. And the main character, the loan shark, I say that the main antagonist in the film, more or less says, if you own the debt, you own the man. He's like, I won't take your money. I'll never accept it, because if you own the debt and you own the man. And sort of like him, it's like an indirect way of simultaneously controlling the old man and eventually, aiming to get his way to marry this, or to be with this young girl when she eventually reaches age. And if you don't want the spoiler alert, you've got 5 or 10 seconds to block your ears or turn off the stream for a second, because I'm going to spoil this, but it's necessary for the framing here. At the end of the film, the loan shark actually meets his fate, and it's really, really interesting. He's running off because he commits some kind of fraud or something, gets caught out, and he's running through the docks on the Thames, and he falls in the river, and I think it's his servant boy, like, reaches out to grab him, but instead he clutches onto his chest, which is full of gold coins and whatever, and he sinks to the bottom of the Thames and he dies. So rather than sort of saving his life and his own life and making do without his money, he drowned with his money. And when you're dead, you can't do anything with your money. And I'm not saying that will be the fate of the cathedral necessarily, but it's just to frame what kind of movie this is and the lessons that it tries to give. And
live by the coin, die by the coin.
Exactly. And I'm not saying this is true of American farmers. The kind of moral framework I'm trying to get at here is that, yes, the subsidies might get you ahead. Yes, your lobby groups might make sure that you're financially furnished, but ultimately that also makes you answerable to someone. It affects your autonomy. And this is like the push with GMO. I mean, for anyone who's familiar with the GMO question, and I mean, I will admit first and foremost to not be expert in GMO, but one of the things with GMO is the fact that you cannot reseed. So the standard practice in cropping with like normal barley, canola, wheat, whatever, is that you plant your crop and you harvest your crop at come summertime, and competent farmers will take their best seed and cheap farmers will keep their worst seed and sell their best one. But essentially, by keeping your best seed and then reseeding with that best seed, you keep refining your crops, you keep refining your varieties, because varieties do change from time to time with breeding programs and whatever. But you can determine how much seed you have. You can determine what you keep, what balance of what varieties and what you do in the next year. Because I'll say, like with wheat, for example, you will have a fast maturing variety and a slow maturing variety, and depending on your rainfall across the growing season, will depend on what proportion of what you plant, and then different varieties thrive on different soil types, and there's a whole bunch of variables, right? With GMO, those seeds are infertile, so when you harvest them, you can only sell them. If you keep them and you try to plant them the next year, you'll get no germination because they don't germinate. They're an infertile seed. So that actually makes you a slave to the system, so that you have to email Monsanto every year and order your seed. And GMO seed is actually really expensive. As I think I read to you there, the current price for wheat is what did I say? I think it was $350 a ton. But for the GMO seeds, they're sort of like a third of that price. So you're already like holding to your own margin by becoming a slave to the system in a way. It's quite grim for Americans, but just in a different way.
Yeah. No, I would. I think those are all good points. Of course, from a market perspective, these subsidies cause all sorts of, malformations, malinvestment, which wouldn't otherwise exist in a kind of more natural economy. So there's that. You may be setting yourself up for, trouble down the road. I could well imagine, particularly if the United States goes through any political turmoil and has difficulty, you know, maintaining these subsidies. Then essentially you're up shit creek without a paddle. But yeah,
Indeed.
it's basically also what Furious Pertinax was saying, a question of ownership, because once you're
Sovereignty.
exactly once you sort of rely on sort of these outside networks or whatnot to sort of basically have your livelihood as a farmer, then you don't call the shots anymore. You grow this stuff, but you're not your own master. So there is that. And I get in the short run that some of these things may be appealing or maybe unavoidable. I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in the farming economy at all, and there's that old line, which is the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. I think that's certainly true. So if you try to get into the farming game today, and you don't, you plan on just sort of going at it the old school way and don't take the subsidies and whatnot, you may have a hard time. You may not be able to sort of make it. But so I think trying to find a ways where you can transition to where you are your own master, in this sense and in others, is probably the best course of action.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. And the thing is, in the Western tradition too, there's a very proud of history of whether it's in the Roman period, we have essentially the backbone of a civilization and its army being more or less the sinewy muscular boys of Latium and of Campania, who conquer Italy 200 or 300 year period, and then in the subsequent 400 or 500 year period conquer the Mediterranean. Although the legion actually does change with the Marian reforms in 100 BC thereabouts. All the heavy fighting prior to then was done by landed citizen soldiers who were primarily agriculturalists. And if you read any sort of ancient source, whether it's when the Greeks first came across the Romans, Pyrrhus of Epirus and Megacles, his right hand man, or you read about the Punic Wars or the Macedonian Wars afterwards. They sort of talk about this inexhaustible manpower of Italy. And I mean, Italy was even though Italy had these, even back then, relatively sophisticated urban centers, whether it was the Etruscan cities, whether it was the Greek cities of the south, Tarentum or Brundisium, Bari, Croton, ancient Reggio di Calabria, which is called Rhegium back then, and the Sicilian cities. I mean, Syracuse was one of the largest cities of the ancient world. And of course, you have Rome and Naples and whatever. But a lot of this Roman strength comes from the fact that it has a very, very productive soil, as it's that heavy volcanic sort of dark soil, and just an agrarian mindset of an agrarian people who were very laborious and very hardworking, and also a nation who, I mean, you got to think it's the Romans who conceive of the idea of the mos maiorum, the ways of the elders, which is sort of, you might say, an ancient chivalry code. And it's on the back of these men that builds the foundation that makes eventually the Roman Empire. There's a very strong tradition of, the European peasanthood. I mean, take, for example, one's conception of, say, if you imagine Robin Hood in your mind and, the bandits of Sherwood Forest. I mean, they're not farmers as such, but they're men of the land. They're men of, out of the city. They're sort of sinewed, hard men who, as the story goes, rob from the rich and give to the needy, etc. Obviously there's a socialist connotation there, but the point I'm trying to make is that there's this wonderful sort of folklore of Europeans and being of the land and having this culture of the harvest and of animal husbandry and of course using technology. I mean, of course, the Romans constructed aqueducts, and I mean, animal husbandry became very sophisticated in continental Europe. I mean, it was essentially the invention of animal husbandry with the agricultural revolution that would occur, around the same time of the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. There was, the Europeans enthusiastically embrace this technology and these advancements, and agriculture and its increasing productivity became a massive part of that. I mean, to some degree, I mean, as an American, I'm sure there's Americans in the audience too. You know, the much of the manpower of the Continental Army, I'm sure, would have probably, I mean, there would have been city folk too, but a lot of them would have come from the country, and and certainly of the militias.
Absolutely.
I mean, they wouldn't have done it without farmers' sons, essentially.
No, absolutely. All right. So I'm just looking here through the comments. Anything else? Okay, cool. I think we'll wrap up here. So if you guys have any...
It was requested that I talk with the South African accent for a little bit, but I think I missed that one. Sorry, mate.
That's okay, man. We appreciate A for effort. So there were much appreciated.
Well, actually, there was a comment further back from that talking about, I think, Afrikaners moving to Australia, and that's actually true. A lot of after as you know, you guys have had hard times there, and a lot of firstly Rhodesians, and secondly South Africans have called Australia home. A, because we're climatically similar. B, we're sort of culturally not too dissimilar. I mean, we both play cricket, for instance. But there's a lot that we share in common, and it's so sad that these people who have left the crucible of the crumbling of the former British Commonwealth in Africa, and now Australia is beset with its own problems that are socio-cultural and ideological and economic, and it's I actually feel for those people quite a bit too, because there's a lot of promise to come here, and many of them have made good lives here. And now, under the present circumstances, it looks to be rather jeopardized, which is a tragedy.
Yeah, no, kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, And I was one of my friend's dads. He, I think they were born in South Africa. Yeah, my friend's dad, he was born in South Africa, and he went to Rhodesia. And then after Mugabe took over, he went back to South Africa because he could see where that was going. And now he's just sort of, in his twilight years, just sort of looking at what's happened to South Africa, since the ANC took over, and it's not good. So, it's just a shit sandwich all around, essentially. And
it is very much so.
Yeah, and in South Africa, at least, the ANC's garbage and whatnot. But in a way, the thing that everyone complains about, their corruption and incompetence, is actually a bit of a benefit, because at the very least, they're not able to enforce some of the more draconian measures nearly as effectively as a place like Australia, for instance. So Australia, is a much more capable state than South Africa is, which is fine when you need your potholes fixed, but not fine when, cops are arresting you for going outside for a walk. So
yeah, daring to inhale clear air outside of your own front door. Yeah, quite.
Yeah, no, it's just bad news all around. So I guess here I'm looking through the comments. I don't see anything particularly recent. All right.
Whilst you do that, can I read this last set of numbers past you? By the way, it's not much. It'll be only 5 minutes, because I obviously spoke about how there had been a massive jump in price in '73 because of that particular circumstance, right? But how inputs had increased dramatically over the last sort of several decades.
Right.
Well, here's two things for everyone, and the first one's just purely quantitative, because a lot of people don't realize this. The volume of water it takes to grow 1 ton of wheat is 800 tons of water. Now, if you extrapolate that in liters, that is 800,000 liters to grow a single ton of wheat. So if you think about how dependent farmers are on you might say on threading the needle with a good year, or being able to farm and undertake cropping in particular climes, it's not something for the faint-hearted. It is actually, and this actually is the cause of a lot of stress, and why you say in drought years farmers do actually off themselves, because to get that the circumstances in order is difficult, and a farmer can do their utmost and just have circumstances take away their hard work, and that's quite the seminal tragedy for these people. And the second thing is, on the topic of water, is Now this, I'm going to bring two sets of stats. One's regarding wheat and the other is barley. So the 10-year average of kilograms of wheat grown per millimeter of water in 10 years ago was 19.2. 5 years ago, the average was 22.5. And last year, which is our most recent records for us, was 26.5. And in terms of barley, 10 years ago, it was 24.5. 5 years ago, it was 28. And our last season was 35.5, which goes to show you that despite the difficulties we've had economically, despite issues we've had regarding trade or in terms of the dramatic increase of input costs, that farmers in Australia who farm competently, farm well, have become dramatically efficient at what they do. And that is something to be applauded. That, like I sort of started this conversation with about how the Australian bushman has been, and the settlers always been very ingenious and hardworking. That culture is still alive today, which is very admirable.
Oh, definitely. It's the necessity being the mother of invention. Once again,
absolutely.
That's also the case here in South Africa as well, because of the climate and of the there's also droughts as well, particularly up in the Northern Cape right now. And as
well, Cape Town's essentially out of water, isn't it? In terms of an urban situation.
Well, we were, but thankfully here in the Cape, we've had since then 2 really strong winters of rainfall, so it topped everything back up, thankfully. But up in the Northern Cape, in the province north of us, they weren't so lucky, so they're still trying to find ways of dealing with the lack of water. And a lot of people are very ingenious and able to sort of be efficient with what they have, but on the other hand, you have a lot of, like you're saying, sort of deaths of despair, and a lot of farms kind of going under because of the disadvantageous weather conditions. But anyways,
I just saw a comment which a little while ago, but just because I talked about like the intensity of direct drilling, like the direct seeding without plowing. So for instance, the old system of farming would have been, and this is obviously more true if you run livestock, as my family have done. You would grow cereal, and a cereal being wheat or barley, something of that family. Grow a cereal and then pasture the next year, and then you sort of you split your arable land so that you would harvest other paddocks at arable and leave the balance 50% pasture, and then every sort of second year you rotate. From season to season you rotate which paddocks are cropped and which paddocks are left pasture. In the context of direct drilling, you can actually increase your utilization, and that's the word I used before, so that, for instance, what we do on our property is we will start any given paddock with a legume, so that will be either a pea crop or a lupin crop. And the reason you do that is because legumes, rather than taking nitrogen out of the soil, in fact put it back in, because they take different nutrients out of the soil in order to grow. So you start with a legume, and then you'll plant wheat, and then you plant canola. And the reason for the canola is that because of the type of plant that it is, you can actually spray over it more frequently. And I mean, I have to admit, I'm not a herbicide or chemical advocate, but this is just the methodology that has worked. So I'm just echoing what's done. But you can spray canola more frequently. Canola is more tolerant, and also between these different crop types, because a legume and a cereal and a canola, because the canola is essentially related to the broccoli family, more or less, right? These plants can tolerate different chemical concoctions. They can tolerate different types of chemical application, and ergo you can engage in better weed control, which increases productivity because you're not having your crops compete with weeds. And also you can upkeep the hygiene of your paddocks, although people from more my critical angle will argue it attacks other forms of biodiversity in the soil, but that's not the discussion we're having. I'll leave that for another day. But then you start off with a legume, you go wheat, you go canola, you can go another cereal, and that can be wheat or barley, and then you go back to legumes. So basically you can continually crop your cropping paddocks without ever necessitating having to leave a pasture. We leave other paddocks pasture on our property because we run livestock. We have a different system. But basically your utilization from year to year to year is dramatically increased. And that's how Australian farmers have actually kept up despite the massive increase in inputs. They've been able to massively increase productivity and yields, and being able to use their surface area, essentially their productive area of their farms, with much greater efficiency.
Mm. No, that's it's this is the sort of knowledge that laymen sort of lack, and the sort of gained experience and understanding of botany essentially, and sort of what
Yeah,
these plants do that sort of makes these
botany,
people,
agronomy, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
makes
I mean,
makes these people
even for
experts.
me, like a lot of people have been talking in the comments, like, oh, what about him? It's like, seriously, I've learned most of this off my dad. Like, I know I talk to my dad and I feel like an ignoramus, oftentimes. I'm just glad you gave me the opportunity to talk tonight about this. And that, for people who aren't in this field, or people who've never had these thoughts, or just don't have anyone around them to tell them any of this sort of stuff. And I know at times I've gone on tangents, and I apologize if I've tested anyone's patience, and I've talked about things, I've drowned on about stats or numbers or whatever. But I did want to frame this in its totality, and I did want to explain things that, had I not talked about them tonight, they probably wouldn't be in the ether of this discussion, certainly within our circle, shall I say. So
No,
I
definitely.
appreciate the chat for being very cooperative, be very patient, and for asking good questions and for being good chaps themselves. Yeah. So unless you've got anything more to ask of me, Mr. Patriarch, or any other things, I suppose we've just hit 2 hours. So yeah, I'll leave it to you, sir.
Yeah, no problem, man. Thanks. And again, I appreciate the detail. I really do. So, I guess, sort of in closing, if you guys are new here, thanks for stopping by. Leave a like, comment if you have anything that you'd like to bring up about this video that you saw. And, I always try to go through the comments if I can. Been real busy of late, but, I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. If you guys also are interested in checking out Marcus's stuff, I left his link to his Twitter. As far as YouTube channel, I do not believe that he has a YouTube channel, but he is a regular guest on Apostolic, or co-host basically at this point, for Apostolic Majesty's YouTube channel. So you can go. Yeah. So if you guys are familiar with Apostolic Majesty, which hopefully you should be, definitely go over there and you can check him out and hear him on there. So in addition to his knowledge on farming, he's actually quite knowledgeable on history as well. So yeah, go check him out over there. Is there anything else that you'd like to shill, sir? Any upcoming streams or anything?
Well, I was going to say, when you sit in a tractor, you have a lot of time to read books. So you might say the knowledge of the two have come hand in hand, fortunately. But in terms of shilling, I actually will be absent next week from Apostolic Majesty's channel with most sadness and regret. So just be him and Columba. But yes, to answer in the comments there, who was it last? Yeah, Ozpexel. Sorry, yes, I haven't quite got to making my own stuff yet. I'm pretty sure I will at some point. Just RL is a little bit hectic for me at present, so I've just been merely roped into guest appearances. And I mean, I've really thoroughly enjoyed this with talking to you, Mr. Patriarch, because I kind of felt we sort of like buddies on UO when we went on with the academic agent. So I sort of end up on academic agents channel every so often, and most weeks I'm doing something with Apostolic Majesty. We have 3 concurrent series that we're doing. We are talking about the nations of Charlemagne, which is about Italy and France and Germany. We have done just part 1 and part 2 of the anatomy of the Austrian Empire and the Habsburg throne. We're also making our way through orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. Our OAN series, which is sort of pertaining to the Slavs and the Byzantines and the Greeks. But I do believe after next week, where I won't be present, Dear Apostolic's taking a bit of a hiatus. I think he's got a few things that he needs to do, but I believe we'll be back online come October, so it's a temporary break. So and of course, with him, with Apostolic taking a break, there's always Mr. Columba to follow, who's a great laugh as well. 3 of us really enjoy what we do. That's about it from my end, Mr. Patriarch. If you fancy, follow on Twitter and get all tidbits about everything from history to nutrition to cooking to coverage, the live coverage of the situation in Australia. And I've thoroughly enjoyed being here. I'm sorry if I have talked and did it on a bit too long, but I hope I answered the question as best as I could, and I hope I've been a good chap to the chat here. And should the opportunity arise, it would be good to do this again at some stage.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. As far as my part, I just put out a video yesterday, titled "Finding Something to Die For." So if you guys are interested and haven't seen it yet, go check that out. I also have another stream on Friday where I'll be having a buddy of mine in the sciences, and we'll be discussing evolutionary theory. So that's going to be another, again, one of those streams where I defer largely to the guest because he, as like Marcus, has a lot to say on the matter that I don't necessarily feel equipped to deal with myself. So
That actually does sound super intriguing, I have to say. That sounds good. So good luck when you have that stream.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, man. And so I guess that'll be it. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time. Patriarch out.
Good night, everyone.